You're all very welcome to Athenry for the first webinar of the Teagasc Virtual Sheep Week. These webinars come to you each night of this week at 7 p.m. My name is Michael Diskin and I'm the Teagasc Sheep Enterprise Leader based here in Athenry. The sheep industry is a very important industry in Ireland. There are in excess of 35,000 sheep farmers producing sheep meat worth in excess of 350 million, of which 80% is exported. Like all farming industries, the sheep industry faces numerous challenges, but indeed it has numerous opportunities as well. Thankfully, this year we have seen an improvement in sheep prices that are most welcome, and hopefully those improved prices can be sustained. The objective of the Teagasc Virtual Sheep Week is to provide the Irish sheep farmers with the most up-to-date technical knowledge emerging from our Teagasc research and knowledge transfer programs that will ultimately improve the profitability and the sustainability of the industry. Tonight's webinar is focused on grassland. Our ability as a country to grow grass is our greatest natural resource. The challenge is to convert that grazed grass into saleable product, namely lamb. Questions we will be addressing in tonight's webinar will be: what are the ideal number of paddocks? What's the role of clover and alternative forages? We will also focus in on some of the exciting research that's ongoing here at Athenry, focused on improving the efficiency with which sheep can utilise grass. I will now hand you over to your host for tonight, Damien Costello, and his panel in studio.
Good evening and welcome to Live at Athenry. As part of Teagasc Virtual Sheep Week, each evening of the week we will be right up to and including Friday, we will be broadcasting live from our studio here in Athenry from 7 to 8 p.m. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the financial contribution of our sponsors for the week, FBD Insurance. As Michael outlined, we will concentrate on a different area of sheep production each evening, and this evening our focus is on grassland management. I'm Damien Costello, Teagasc Sheep Specialist, and for the next hour or so we're going to look at how implementing good grassland management practices and technologies at farm level can have very positive benefits on flock performance, which of course in turn improves profitability of the sheep enterprise. Added to this, there are also environmental benefits associated with it. The format for the evening is that we will be having we've compiled a number of short video clips which will set the scene for our panel discussion. You, the viewers, will also have the opportunity to put your questions to the panel by typing your question in the comment box on whichever platform you're using to view the proceedings this evening. I will then put the question to the panel on your behalf. So let's meet the panel. First, I'd like to welcome John O'Connell. John is a farmer from County Leitrim. He's a long-serving participant in the Teagasc Better Farm programme. So maybe, John, you might say a word as to what's happening on your farm.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, I'm farming just out to the Ballinamore in County Leitrim, farming 34 hectares. Lowland flock of ewes, mid-season lamb and flock, and I also have contract rearing heifers. And I'm in the Sheep Better Farm programme since 2014.
And last year, John, you, as part of the Grass 10 programme, you were selected as the Grassland Farmer of the Year in the sheep section. Well done on that.
Yeah, it was nice to achieve that. Over the years, obviously, I've been growing grass and measuring grass, and it was nice to be recognised for my efforts, I suppose.
Yeah. We look forward, I suppose, to hearing how you got there, I suppose, during the next hour or so.
Thanks, Steve.
Next up, my colleague, Micheál O'Leary. Welcome, Micheál. Micheál heads up Pasture Base Ireland. And maybe, Micheál, you might tell us a little bit about yourself and what a little bit about Pasture Base.
Thanks, Declan. I'm Micheál O'Leary, based in Moore Park in Fermoy, and I'm heading up the Pasture Base Ireland, which is a grassland management tool, I suppose, used by farmers like John up and down the length and breadth of the country. So I suppose it helps farmers, I suppose, to manage their grass, number one, and hopefully to grow and utilise more grass, and I suppose to leave more money in the farmer's pocket at the end of the day.
Very good, Micheál. And last but not least, we welcome another colleague of mine, Philip Creighton. And Philip is a grassland systems researcher based here in the Teagasc Research Demo Farm in Athenry. Welcome, Phil, and maybe just give us a short synopsis of your current work.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. So, as you say, I'm based here in Athenry. I'm looking at sheep grassland systems research. I suppose what we're about is trying to develop grassland systems, grassland management practices that will ultimately be of benefit to Irish sheep farmers, that hopefully will lead to a profitable, sustainable system.
Very good. Okay, to get proceedings underway, our cameras hit the road recently to visit John's farm in lovely Leitrim. So we focused pretty much on his paddock grazing system, his rotational grazing system. So let's have a look at the clip and hear from John as to what John had to say about grassland management on his farm.
Yeah, I suppose one of the main changes over the last number of years is the whole fencing infrastructure that I've put in place. So I would have fenced under the Teagasc grant both the home farm here, which consists of 17 hectares, and the out farm, which would be equally the same amount of ground, another 17 hectares. And I've increased the number of paddocks, permanent paddocks. So, for instance, this farm here would have something like 5 or 6 fields or permanent paddocks back many years ago. In recent years, I've introduced a lot more permanent paddocks, so there will be 12 paddocks here on this farm alone. And then during the year, as needs be, those paddocks will be split according to what I would need for the demand of grass, and in order to utilise and manage the grass as best I could. In most cases, it's all permanent sheep wire fencing you can see in place here in all the paddocks. The main reason why I would have put in the permanent fencing was to manage the paddocks better. So basically, if you go back 7 or 8 years ago, the sheep decided where they wanted to go. Now I decide where the sheep want to go. And it means that I can manage the grass better, and I can grow more grass because I'm managing the grass better, and better quality grass. And also utilization is a lot better. By just putting the sheep in, or the fencing infrastructure in place, it has improved the quality of grass just by them means alone. Yeah, by putting in all the extra divisions, I'm growing more grass, but I'm also growing better quality grass. By growing better quality grass, that in effect had a knock-on effect on lamb performance, because I'm growing better grass for the lambs, so it has eliminated a lot of concentrate feeding. And then the ewes are coming in behind them, cleaning out them paddocks, and the ewes are also in better condition. So basically what it means is there's more money in my pocket at the end of the day, because my concentrate bill will be down from what it would have been.
So, John, from the clip, we see that you've mentioned that you use a lot of temporary divisions, as well as increasing the number of permanent divisions on your farm since you joined the Better Farm program. Do you find the temporary divisions at certain times of the year a big help in managing your grass?
Yeah, without a doubt, Damien. It gives me great flexibility, in managing grass, as you said, at certain times of the year, in particular in springtime, as I'm turning ewes and lambs out to grass. Obviously, they're not all in one mob together. But then when I get them grouped together, I wouldn't use the temporary fencing as much. But then come weaning time, the temporary fencing comes into its own again, where I'm splitting paddocks up. Also, when lambs are split up, ewe lambs and ram lambs, it gives me that advantage. I can split paddocks up again when I'm forward grazing lambs in front of ewes. So a lot of the year I would use temporary fencing at some stage, and it does give that flexibility to manage the grass better.
Okay. I suppose a lot of people watching in, John, will maybe count this as a lot of work. I suppose the question, does it take a lot of time to get this temporary fencing open?
The short answer to that, Damien, is no. It doesn't take long, really. I can put up the flexi net wire almost as fast as you would walk, or take it down, whatever the case may be. So really, there's not that much work. Once you have the permanent paddocks in place and the infrastructure in place, it really doesn't take much time to put up the temporary fencing.
So it's well worth the effort, I suppose, in terms of the payback.
Yeah.
And I suppose we're coming off a period of very strong grass growth, I suppose, over the last couple of months. But that was coupled, I suppose, with fairly poor grazing conditions. Did you find the extra divisions help you cope with this kind of difficult grazing conditions?
Yeah, once again, it gives you that flexibility. It's great, and like when grass utilization isn't as good, you can even back fence yos and keep them off part of a paddock. And when ground conditions are very sticky, like we went through a very, very wet period. Things have bounced back quite a bit in the last week or so, or 2 weeks. But in order to get more value out of the grass, I would use the temporary fencing quite a bit during times like that. So there's so many times of the year that the fencing will be used. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose we're approaching now the time of the year, John, where it's time to start thinking about closing up the paddocks for the winter at this time of the year. From a practical point of view, how do you decide what order to close them up in? We'll say.
Well, I suppose from now on, I'd be getting ready for the winter plan or autumn plan for getting grass lined up and getting it ready for next spring. So at the moment, I would be grazing the paddocks that are closest to the yard and the most sheltered paddocks. So usually the most sheltered paddocks are the ones closest to the yard. So as I have them paddocks with the heaviest covers of grass next spring when I'm turning ewes out, because for convenience, number one, for getting ewes and lambs out to grass, and number two, for the most sheltered paddocks, which are usually, for me in particular, around the yard. And then I work my way out through the farm. So the last paddocks usually close up will be the ones furthest away. So I'm on the second last rotation now, grazing those paddocks. So hopefully by the time I get into middle of October, I'll be starting to close up some of them paddocks and have maybe 20% of the farm closed up by the middle or end of October.
Very good, very good. I'll give you a breather for a second, John, and I'll maybe bring in Michal there. I suppose, Michal, from a pasture-based point of view, would you notice, we'll say, farms that would have a good autumn closing plan in place versus farms who maybe delayed the closing of their paddocks, or have very little of a plan, I suppose, really?
There's definitely a difference. Because I suppose the farms that have a plan in place, that they know their limits that they have to reach, they have to do graze X amount of their farm per week, or by the end of the month that they need X amount grazed, so many hectares, or such percentage of the farm. But they know when they can push their limits. So if they have reached the target, that's it. If they're finished grazing for the year, they're not going to regraze another paddock or something like that. So definitely we can see from pasture base, anyone that has a rotation planner done or a budget done, they're definitely hitting the targets. And I suppose the most important thing is to leave grass there over the winter period. Not to graze the farm, graze all the grass in the farm, and then we'll come out then in March maybe, and there'll be nothing on it. So I suppose the general rule of thumb would be, as John kind of started it already, for a mid-season flock, you're probably 20% between, I suppose, the middle to the end of October, another 20% to the middle of November, probably 60% up until the end of November, and then probably 80% somewhere around the middle of December. So they'd be roughly the targets for a mid-season flock. And I suppose the most important thing is that you don't delay in closing. So once the middle of October does come, you have it in your mind that, right, this is the last time I'm going to graze this paddock in 2020. And we can see from pasture base that every week delaying in closing a paddock, you're less 77 kilos of dry matter per hectare come the springtime. So you're leaving it there in order to turn out your lactating your young lambs into top quality grass.
And again, I think on the social media releases during the day, we had a video, and there's a template for an autumn closing planner, and that will be available to people on the website from tomorrow. Phil, maybe I'd bring you in there as well, just in terms of the importance of grazing out the swards properly at closing time. You might comment on that, or why it's so important.
Yeah, Damien. So actually, it's as the lads have been outlining there, we're on about closing from the middle to the end of October. Really, we need to be actually starting that closing plan now, because in a month's time, you're going to be starting your last grazing rotation. So the key thing this week, and especially now that the weather conditions are good, is that you map out what fields you're going to close first. So the one John talked about there, the one closest to the yard, the sheltered field, that you really need to be grazing that this week and graze it out to 4.5 centimetres, so that when you're grazing it the next time round for the last time, that it's easy to clean out, it's easy to graze out properly. We'll have to remember that at that time you always be out with rams, you don't want putting them under too much pressure. So take the opportunity now, so that it'll actually be very easy to move through that paddock and have it closed and growing for the spring.
Yeah, and so it's important to obviously to plan ahead. And I just bring you in maybe again, John, in terms of you know, I suppose from once you have closed the paddock, I'd say, look, it's important that they stay closed. Sometimes you get a bit of growth and you may be tempted to get another grazing out of it. You know, it's important that they remain closed for the winter once you do close them.
Most definitely. And some years ago, something similar like that happened to me, in that I had a lot of grass. I had paddocks I had closed up, but when I looked out at all this grass, I was tempted to graze them again, and I did. But unfortunately, I paid for it the following spring, and my local Teagasc advisor at the time, who's still with me, Tom Call, had said to me, you shouldn't have done it. And when I did, I grazed them out, but I lived to regret it the following spring. And it's something I've learned.
A lesson learned.
I didn't do it again, you know.
Yeah. So again, I suppose just to remind people that viewers, that you can type in your questions in the comment box on whatever platform you're following. While we were down at John's farm, we also put together a clip on John's experience in terms of grass measuring. So again, we'll have a look and we'll hear John will share his experience of grass measuring on the farm.
I started measuring grass, I suppose, the year that I joined the Sheep Better Farm program. And I was asked by the powers that be at the time, would I measure grass? And of course, the question I had at the time was, what benefit would it be for me to measure grass? But as the years went by and I started measuring grass, okay, I was a little bit apprehensive initially, but I did see the value in measuring grass, and it's something that I think has been a great benefit to me over the years for productivity and basically turning the farm around as far as production on the farm. Yeah, to get used to actually of measuring grass and using what I use as actually a plate meter for measuring the grass. And yes, initially it took a little bit of time to get used to it, and basically the whole practicalities of using the plate meter and taking the number of drops and getting confident using it and putting the information onto the system, onto pasture base. But I think I would safely say after one season of using the plate meter, I was quite confident using it. Yeah, so when I'm measuring grass, I try to measure on a weekly basis over the growing season. And that involves going out and taking a minimum of 20 drops with the plate meter, going around each paddock. And then the recordings I take from that, without going into detail on it now, the recordings I take from that, I go back to pasture-based system and I load that information or put that information in the system. And then pasture-based can give me a lot of information from that. And a few figures that jump out of me are days ahead. So I know how many days ahead I have. I know what the farm cover is at the actual time. I know what the cover is on each individual paddock. So it's measured in kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And it can also tell me how long a residency or time I can keep the number of stock in that field. Now, it's important, of course, information in. If you put the right information in, you get value out of it. So it's important to put in what stock is on the farm. And by doing that, you get an idea how much grass you have ahead of you. And as I said earlier on, it's very important during the peak growing season when you have surplus grass, you can skip paddocks with confidence, you can take them paddocks out. And also, it identifies paddocks at the end of the year, which paddocks or which fields have grown the most tonnage of grass. And I can identify paddocks that are not performing as well. And I can investigate then and see, is it a fertility issue or is it north facing, south facing, is it the whole soil structure? So there's an awful lot to be taken from pasture base.
So back to yourself, John. Could I ask you, what do you see are the big benefits of measuring grass throughout the growing season, from your experience of it over the last number of years?
Yeah, Damien, since I started measuring grass, I suppose one of the big benefits is that I'm growing a lot more grass and I'm growing better quality grass. Also, I've noticed that the sward is an awful lot cleaner in that I would use very little herbicides or pesticides and a lot more ryegrass in the sward, just by managing it better and measuring and growing that better grass. Also, by measuring that grass, it gives me confidence to make management decisions throughout the year. And there's a few, every measurement is important, but a closing measurement at the end of the year and an open measurement tells me how much grass I grew over the rest period or over the winter period. So they're important measurements. Also, I can make decisions during the year whether to take out silage or skip paddocks. So, for instance, in the peak growing season, when it's usually very difficult to manage all that grass, I can, by using pasture base and by measuring the grass, I can take out paddocks and I can take some of this really good quality silage. So I don't bother wasting time topping off paddocks. I make that good quality silage, move on, and when they come back around to the next rotation, I can have nice quality grass in front of yours again. So by measuring grass, it also improves the quality, it improves the output, and improves performance on yours. And it lessens my concentrate bill because, of course, good quality silage.
Yeah, that was a point that struck me there. Again, these surplus bales you're taking out, you're obviously cutting very leafy material and that kind of thing. Have you found, we'll say, you'd be obviously doing silage analysis each year. Have you found that it has kind of cut your concentrate bill because you're making really high quality silage?
Yeah. So like over the years, the quality of the silage has increased each year on year, and this good quality silage, as I would call it, is rocket fuel, and that silage is so valuable to yours, say pre-lambing, and it cuts down on the concentrate bill in that I wouldn't have to introduce concentrate maybe as soon to yours as what I used to have to do. So it's all back to the measuring of the grass and recording that and knowing what paddocks are available, what grass is available.
And as you say, if you have the information, you have the confidence to make decisions.
Exactly.
You're not you're not shooting in the dark, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe, Micheál, in terms of pasture base, can you, I suppose, we can see an example, our viewers can see an example coming up on the screen of a pasture base report for John's farm. It's based on a recent measurement last week. Can you just maybe describe what kind of information is needed to generate this kind of a report, we'll say, or
Yes, so you can see the report there on your screens now at the moment. And I suppose if we look at the bottom, if we just look at the bar chart or the grass wedge as what it's known as, and we can see the paddock on the left-hand side. So that's the highest, the cover with the highest, the paddock with the highest cover on the farm. And cover of 1,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare. And then if we look to the right-hand side, we can see there paddock number 1, and that has the lowest cover on the farm. So that would have been a paddock that would have been recently grazed. So in order to input this data, I suppose John, he goes out onto the farm every week and he uses a plate meter and he drops the plate meter roughly about 20 times in every paddock to get, I suppose, a representative height of the whole paddock. He then puts that height into pasture base for each paddock. And along then with his stock numbers. So whatever stock is grazing on the farm on that particular day, he puts that in. And I suppose their intakes then are calculated by the mean lambing date, which John has put in earlier on in the year. So John puts in the mean lambing date once, and it'll calculate the intake for the ewes and the lambs for each week.
So it's not a lot of information, really, that the system does a lot of the calculations in the background sort of thing.
It does, yeah. So at the moment, we just have heights and we have the stock on the farm. Okay. And then I suppose what's calculated then, I suppose the big figures are the farm cover, the growth rate there, which is 92, and the demand there, which is 26. And I suppose a figure that John would always be looking to then is the number of days ahead, which are 34 days ahead there on this particular wedge, which is a little ahead of target. We'd be aiming for around 30, but I suppose it's better to have grass this time of the year rather than be looking for it.
Yeah, so those are the kind of the key figures you'd be looking at.
They're the key figures, I suppose, growth, demand, and days ahead, really.
Yeah.
I suppose John might concord with those.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, it's very important. The figures that I would look at, and they're the kind of figures when I put the information in each week on pasture base, I look to see what my farm cover is, my daily growth rate, and days ahead, and from them 3 figures alone, I can make a lot of decisions.
Yeah. And maybe just to bring Phil in there on it, an important kind of bit of information you can get from measuring grass is the total amount of grass that the farm is capable of growing in the year. Again, that's some of your previous work would say that's very important in terms of matching the stocking rate or having the appropriate stocking rate, we'll say, of ewes on your farm vis-a-vis the amount of grass the farm is capable of growing.
Yeah, absolutely, Damien. I suppose, you know, in terms of the day-to-day or the week-to-week benefits of grass measuring, the lads have covered that fairly well in terms of the ability to make decisions, you know, as regards grazing management or taking out surplus or whatever. Another massive benefit really in the longer term would be that you will have generated actual data for your farm. So our job here, I suppose, on the research demonstration farm is to try and develop the grassland targets, the guidelines that then can be implemented at farm level. And I suppose something that did come from, you know, some of our recent grazing work was that to support 1 ewe on our lambs for the year, you need to grow 1 tonne of grass dry matter. So what in essence that tells us then that on that particular trial, a stocking rate of 12 ewes per hectare was the most profitable because we were actually growing 12 to 13 tonnes. So we were utilising the grass, turning it into lamb meat, which we were turning into output, which ended up creating profit for the farm. But there is maybe a perception that, you know, we should address that we didn't design that trial to tell everybody to stock their farm at 12 ewes per hectare. We designed the trial in such a way that we generate as much information as possible that can then be, you know, used on your own farms, lots of different circumstances, different places. But if you know that you need to grow 1 tonne per ewe, then you can set the appropriate stocking rate for your farm at that time. And then as you make improvements like putting in paddocks, addressing soil fertility, starting to measure grass to get better at managing it, then you can increase your stocking rate, which will increase your output and hopefully profitability. But it shouldn't be done until those steps are taken. I think, John, you had an example of that, you know, when you started.
We were chatting to John earlier on, I suppose. Maybe, John, can you give us an idea in terms of, you know, if you have the figures, how your grass production, I suppose, increased on the farm when you took the key steps, such as kind of improving soil fertility and getting your grazing infrastructure right and so on?
Well, all of the aforementioned infrastructure, soil fertility, getting all that right. Like back when I started measuring grass in 2013, 2014, I was growing something in the region of around 7 tonne of dry matter per hectare. And I was stocked at somewhere in the region of around 7 ewes on the lambs per hectare. I'm now stocked at 11.5 ewes per hectare, and I'm growing in excess of 12 to 13 tonne, varies from year to year. But it's an important figure, and it's interesting listening to Philip talking about that figure, or Michal about that, because it really does match up. That 1 tonne of dry matter per hectare is capable of looking after a ewe on our lambs for the year. Yeah. So it's a good measure and sticks of this.
Good ballpark figure, yeah. and as you obviously you've tailored your stocking rate, you've increased your output, you've increased your profitability, I suppose, as a result of growing and properly utilising this extra grass as well. Yeah. There's just a question in from I'm checking the iPad here. I'll maybe give it to Phil. Is strip grazing, Phil, in your opinion, as beneficial as a rotational paddock grazing system? Or has it a place in terms of
Yeah, so I suppose it depends on the circumstances. You know, rotational grazing, or the way we've described it there with John, you know, by putting in temporary fences, we may have 5 permanent paddocks for a group of sheep, and we're able to divide that then temporarily into 10 divisions, say, okay, and for the main part of the year, you can rotate around like that, drop out half paddocks or whatever to maintain the quality, take out surpluses. Strip grazing, probably this time of year, maybe when we're talking about, we mentioned heavy covers, maybe when ground conditions aren't perfect, we can reduce the area even more and give them enough for a day or two that if conditions are challenging, that we're not letting them into a full field and they're walking grass into the ground or dirtying grass that they then won't eat or utilise. So, I mean, it's part of one and the same, but it's adapting to the circumstances, really.
Okay. Very good. Next up, I think we took our cameras out to the farm here in Athenry, and we met up with Phil here beside us. So Phil, give us an update on some of the work he's doing on the role of clover in sheep grazing swards. So let's have a look, and we'll hear from Phil.
Athenry is focusing on the impact of incorporating white clover into sheep graze swards on the productivity of pasture-based land production systems. We are placing a special emphasis on animal, environmental and economic impacts of these systems. Within this work, we are evaluating the effect of incorporating white clover into sheep graze swards at 2 fertiliser nitrogen application rates and 2 stocking rate levels. The 2 stocking rate levels are 11 or 13 ewes per hectare, with 3 pasture treatments at each stocking rate. The first being a perennial ryegrass only sward receiving 145 kilograms of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year. The second being perennial ryegrass plus white clover receiving also 145 kilograms of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year. And the third treatment being perennial ryegrass plus white clover at 90 kilograms of chemical nitrogen applied per year, our low nitrogen treatment. The incorporation of white clover into the sward relative to perennial ryegrass only swards has resulted in lambs reaching slaughter 9 days faster. In terms of sward dry matter production, all 3 pasture treatments are producing a similar total annual yield of approximately 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. This is actually a very positive result in that the low nitrogen treatments are growing just as much grass as the other 2 higher nitrogen treatments with or without the inclusion of white clover. We will continue to monitor this trial over time to assess if this effect can be maintained, but it has potential to have major implications from both an economic and environmental point of view, while also improving animal performance. So there's a win-win at farm level. Key issues that we are continuing to focus on is the persistency of the clover in the grazing sward to assess the longer term benefits to both the animal and the sward.
So, Philip, in relation to your work that featured in the clip, am I correct in saying that your grass clover treatment with the low nitrogen input seems to be growing the same amount of grass annually as the high nitrogen treatment? Am I right in saying that? Or
yeah, that's exactly what's happening, Damien. I suppose if we look at it, and there's in essence, there's very little difference. They're basically growing the same amount of grass, and you'd say, well, that's not really a result. For me, that's a very positive result in that we're actually spreading 40% less chemical nitrogen on the low nitrogen treatments for the grass clover swards. And we're achieving the same level of production, which what we've talked about already in terms of carrying capacity, being able to support those higher profitable stocking rates is very positive. I suppose a bit of a question mark that we still have is maybe around the seasonality of that production. So clover will come into its own from, we say, May time onwards when soil temperatures warm up and starts really fixing the nitrogen and contributing to the mid-season.
So there could be issues at the shoulders of the year, such a thing.
Possibly. I suppose what we're seeing is that particularly in the autumn time, because we've reduced the nitrogen application rates are very similar in the spring until we get to around May time, when the clover starts, working. But because of that, then we've quite low levels all the way through the summer and into the autumn. And it's the autumn application of nitrogen that 1 or 2 years now we've seen where maybe it's been harder for us to build grass covers in the autumn on the low nitrogen treatment. So I think it's a case of going back and maybe manipulating the spreading pattern, maybe saving a bit more of that nitrogen for later in the year when growth conditions are a little bit lower, and taking more advantage of the clover in the mid-season there when it's really at its most active.
Yeah. I suppose a lot of people, Phil, ask the question in terms of the persistency or how long clover will last in a grazing situation or in a sward grazing cutting situation. Are you looking at that as part of your study?
Definitely. So as part of any of these grazing system studies, we look at them over the longer term. So we don't take 1 or 2 years in isolation. We take 3 or 4 or 5 years. And certainly clover and the persistency of clover is an issue that will come up at farm level in terms of establishing the clover in the first place and then maintaining the clover. Sheep are quite selective grazers and they can graze out clover. So the first thing we would say is that it should be a small leaf clover, which is more persistent, more tolerant of tight sheep grazing. But then after that, management practices like what we've discussed there in terms of rotational grazing, paddock grazing, where we're getting in and out of paddocks relatively quickly, so grazing in 2 or 3 days, getting the sward open, cleaned out, and plenty of light down to the base of the sward. The stolons, that basically let the clover develop and spread out across the ground. If they're shaded out, if we allow big, heavy covers of grass consistently grow during the year, maybe take less grazings, the grass canopy comes up, chokes out the light, and the clover, dies off. So really all the basic principles of good grazing management for grass are hugely beneficial to maintaining clover content. So, 3 weeks growing, 3 days grazing, and never letting the canopy get too strong in terms of grazing at that 7 or 8 centimetres or around 1,200 kilos of grass diameter per hectare.
Yeah, and again, we spoke earlier there, we say about your closing plan and getting paddocks properly grazed out. The same principles, I suppose, apply in terms of maintaining clover in the sward as well.
Exactly. So, the idea of grazing out swards properly so that there's no dead material in the base of the sward, so that the grass that we have to graze then next March is good leafy, high quality material. The same thing for the clover. If we can graze out properly now, it means the light is getting down to the base of that sward, and the stolons will be able to spread over the winter period, and we will have a good proportion of clover come the spring. Versus if we don't graze out properly, a lot of dead material left, light won't be getting to where it needs to get to, and we will have lower clover contents.
Yeah. And in terms, maybe, I suppose, just to finish up, in terms of kind of the practical side of things, maybe in terms of fertilizer or chemical nitrogen applications, sort of general tips, I suppose, in terms of timing of nitrogen applications for the high clover swards. What's your feeling on that? Was there?
Yeah, so for our purpose here, when we're talking about the high clover, high nitrogen treatments, we're basically spreading the same pattern as we would have for a grass only sward. So what we would have developed over the last number of years on our grass studies. Yeah. So the difference between the high nitrogen and the low nitrogen here is that come May time, we basically half the application rate every time for the low nitrogen. So again, that's related to your stocking rate. So you spread enough fertilizer to grow enough grass to support your stocking rate. And we do have targets there for different stocking rates.
Very good. So next, I suppose, as well as we've heard the story, I suppose, or the update on clover, as well as that, some of Philip's work is looking at other companion forages that are included in grass mixes. And we're now going to look at a clip where we'll hear from Lisa McGrain, who's a Walsh scholar that's working closely with Phil, and she's carrying out plot work on the alternative forages or the companion forages. So let's hear from Lisa.
The aim of this project is to evaluate a range of alternative forages in combination with perennial ryegrass and their potential to increase animal performance and output in pasture-based sheep production systems. The forages or forage mixtures that we are investigating are perennial ryegrass only, perennial ryegrass plus white clover, perennial ryegrass plus red clover, perennial ryegrass plus plantain, and perennial ryegrass plus chicory. The incorporation of these companion forages could complement perennial ryegrass to maintain or enhance pasture quality and production. Alternative forage-specific benefits have also been reported. White and red clovers have the ability to fix nitrogen and so reduce the need for chemical nitrogen application. Chicory and plantain have good drought tolerance and contain beneficial minerals and trace elements. Chicory is also reported to have an anthelmintic effect on sheep, reducing worm burden in the animals. A farmlet study is underway here in Athenry to evaluate the effect of these forages on sward and animal performance. This study will assess the suitability of these forages under grazing systems for pasture-based sheep production and determine if there are subsequent benefits in overall sward and animal performance. A key area of my work is centred here on plots which are grazed by sheep. These trials investigate management issues or questions around establishment method, seeding rate of the grass and companion forage mixtures, and optimum post-grazing sward height. The aim of this work is to identify if any of these key management steps influence the persistency and longevity of the companion forages, as well as their contribution to animal and sward performance.
So, Philip, following on from the clip, I suppose the work on companion forages has been ongoing here on the farm since 2018, probably starting with field trials. What have we learned so far, or what do we know so far?
Yeah, so I suppose the idea behind this trial was that we've developed our thinking and a lot of our targets and that, you know, in pure grass swords. We've advanced our thinking and knowledge around grass plus white clover, but we're kind of looking, you know, what else is going on around the place and what other forages potentially could be the next step up again. So that's why we're looking at the red clover, the plantain and the chicory. I suppose first impressions, first results from those paddock trials, as you said, certainly there's great potential there, and that we've either equaled the in terms of lamb performance, we've equaled the performance of the lambs on the grass white clover treatment, which was already ahead of the grass only treatments, where there was no companion forage, or we've exceeded them in some cases in these other, we call them novel forages. I suppose the challenge with it is that there would appear that we certainly need to adapt our management, adapt the way that we sow and we manage these swords to get the full potential from these forages. So persistency maybe not quite as good, or you know, maybe disappearing from the sword a little bit faster. So with that in mind, I suppose we've put a lot of work. Well, Lisa has put a lot of work. She's doing most of the heavy lifting on this one, but we've put a lot of detailed plots in here in terms of plots that are grazed by sheep, as close to real world conditions as we can get. And we're looking at some of the issues that we think are causing these differences in performance or persistency. So some of them would be around even just the seed mixture, you know, the percentage of grass versus forage that we're sowing and the rates that we're sowing them at, how we're sowing them, so method, whether maybe the more traditional methods are better or maybe not so good compared to more mint-hill type methods. So we have a range of different comparisons there. And also we're looking at post-grazing height, so the intensity which we graze these. So our traditional targets that we've talked about a lot this evening already in terms of managing grass swords or even grass white clover swords, maybe aren't the best fit for these other forages to get the most potential from them. So I suppose where we are is that we know that there is potential there and that they can, you know, result in very good animal performance. It's how we refine our management now and our advice to get that out onto farm level, to make the most of these.
Yeah. So as you mentioned there, and we saw it in the clip with Lisa there. She's carrying out plot work at the minute, and those are really the key questions you're trying to answer, that you'll be able to sort of, I suppose, if you like, refine your advice in terms of how they're managed and what proportion of you know, the seed rates and so on, or the mix of grass and the companion forages. Is that what you?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So again, I suppose you know, again, critical to all of that, Phil, I suppose, and I maybe come back to John and talk about it in a little bit, is in terms of soil fertility. But I just see on the iPad here, there's what type of grass do you use? That question actually came in when we were covering the clover, but I assume it's, you know, what grass varieties are you using? As we'll say, if you go through first, or is it the same for what you put with the clover as you put with the
So in general, I suppose we're working with perennial ryegrass, and a couple of key things from my point of view when we're looking at establishing swords for sheep. Number one is that it's late heading, a late heading variety, so that we can get as close to weaning as possible without that plant going to seed, to maintain the leaf quality as close to weaning as possible. And then when it does start to naturally head, you know, in the run up to weaning, we can actually use the ewes post weaning on the next grazing rotation to clean out swords if they do get that little bit stemmy or whatever. The next will be that it has good spring growth. Very high demand for grass in the spring, as we've outlined already. So something that is going to have grass there. If we follow our closing plan, there's grass going to be there on the ground when we turn out ewes and lambs in the spring. And number three, I suppose, is the quality. So something that's going to have a good quality figure. And And all of those things are covered through the pasture profit index. So the Teagasc pasture profit index will rate varieties based on a lot of different traits. But as I said, the three key ones for me, if I was selecting a sward for sheep, would be the heading date, the spring growth or spring production, and the quality figure.
Okay, very good. And something just, I think it was John, we were chatting to John over a cup of tea earlier on. Are you looking at things like you will say a lot of farmers ask the question about the persistency of, say, white clover versus red clover, or have you any sort of...
Yeah, so the reason maybe that white clover has been adopted and used already in grazing systems is that white clover, as we mentioned with its stolons, will spread across the top of the ground and kind of cling to the ground. It doesn't really have a stem as such, whereas red clover will have a more erect type of a stem. So its growing point is quite high up in the sward, which means that if the growing point is damaged by excess grazing or even just selective grazing, so as we said, sheep can be quite selective when grazing, and they tend to go for the likes of clover or herbs or whatever first, because it's leafier, more digestible, and they like, it's like going into a bowl of sweets or whatever, you know, they'll go for the nice stuff first. And that has the potential then that it's not going to be as tolerant and may die out of the sward. So that's why we're looking at different varieties of these forages, but also how they're established, the density they're established, and the management after in terms of grazing intensity.
Very good. Something that we mentioned earlier, and I suppose I can put it to the three, I suppose, and maybe John in particular. I know there was a video release earlier on in the day where John's advisor, Tom Call, outlined some of the steps that John would have taken in relation to soil fertility on the farm. Maybe, John, can you give us an idea in terms of improving P&K and the lime status on your farm, the kind of steps you've had to take, I suppose, and the kind of difference it made, I suppose, in terms of, you mentioned you've gone from growing 7 tons up to 12 or 13 tons or 14 tons almost of grass. So it's surely one of the key blocks in the process of growing more grass on the farm.
Yes, it is, and it goes hand in hand with management. But getting the soil fertility and the soil health right, it took time. But I suppose the first thing I had to do was go in and do a soil analysis and find out where I was at. So my pHs were low, so I had to address that first of all. And just by getting the pHs up and correcting the pHs, I was able to free up a lot of nitrogen that was locked up in the soil. So that was a plus straight away. But then I had to also address the P's and K's. And I think in my local Teagasc advisor, Tom Call, alluded to that earlier on in the video, that a lot of the P's and K's were down at 2. So we had to correct that. So over the last number of years, my fertilizer program really starts off with a half a bag of urea, a blanket spread across all the ground in the beginning of February or whenever ground conditions improve enough to get out. And then from then on, all throughout the spring, I try to address the P's and K's. So I'd be going out usually with something like 18-6-12 with sulfur for the spring period. And then for the rest of the summer, I'd be going back with protected urea. And then the latter part of the year, maybe a bag of 18-6-12 or K's, just K's. And then the other part of it too would be, I try to replenish. The slurry years ago for me, I used to class it as a nuisance. Now I class it as a nutrient. Yeah. So I try to go back out with the slurry on ground that I would have taken silage out. So basically, I'm recycling the slurry back onto the ground. So those paddocks in particular are fields where you're pulling bales of silage off. You are pulling a lot of P and K out of. So that's something I've got into the habit of doing, is getting back out and getting the slurry on those paddocks. And maybe the whole thoughts of going little and often, rather than going with a heavy dress in a slurry, little and often, and getting the P's and K's back out in that. So the whole soil health status and the whole soil nutrition end of it has been very important. And it, I suppose, goes hand in hand with the management of the grass and getting it all right.
Absolutely.
They work together, you know.
They work together, yeah. And again, as you mentioned at the start, the importance of getting your lime status right as well, so that when the nutrients are applied, you know, you're at the right pH to use them. Thanks, John. I'm just noticing again on the iPad here, there's a couple of questions. There's Dermot asks, I think it's one for Phil. In terms of the mixed species sward, we talked earlier on, we'll say, about taking out surplus bales and that kind of thing. Is that an option with we'll say you can answer it for both, I suppose, with the clover swards or with the companion forages swards. Can it be baled if paddocks get too strong?
Yeah, so it can. I suppose just to be aware that any of them, whether it's clovers or herbs, they are lower in dry matter, regardless. So we say if we had a dry matter in grass of 18, it's probably going to be 2 or 3% lower in your herb or your clover. So it will be more important. It's always important for sheep to try and get, silage as dry as possible, but it will be very important that we're not ensiling that in let's say, wetter conditions. So to try and take that out when we know we're going to get a good wilt. But the other thing I suppose to watch with that as well is the mowing height. So as we said, the growing height of these, the red clover or the herbs, you may have to raise the bed of the mower slightly, or else you're going to hit the growing point of those forages, and you could do damage.
You're not cutting it as bare as you'd cut a traditional grass.
You need to bring it up a little
grass
bit.
crop. Yeah. And just while we're with you, Phil, we have another one here. Andrew asks, is the complementary forage experiment a progression of the work on multi-species swards, or how does it compare?
So it's a collaboration, really. I should have said. So Lisa is a Teagasc UCD Walsh scholar. So the work that's ongoing in UCD is multi-species, in that everything is sown together. What we're doing here is that they're sown individually. So it's a ryegrass plus one of the components of those multi-species swards individually. The reason for that is that, again, can we try and pinpoint which of the forages maybe are most suited to a particular management, to maybe selective grazing by sheep, or even by location. So the likes of chicory, in theory, doesn't really like very wet conditions. So that may be something that will come out of this as well, and that we can pick out location effects. So absolutely, it's a collaboration, but it's a different angle, rather than repeating. We're a small industry, we don't want to be repeating work.
Okay, very good, very good. Again, maybe John, just one thing that struck me from watching your video clip, and your pasture, I suppose, and I think you mentioned it yourself earlier on, your pasture is very clean in terms of weed control. Do you find, I suppose, that or is it that you're using a lot of herbicides on the farm, or is good grassland management practices?
Yeah, it's something that was commented upon some time back. It was a group out on the farm, and they commented on how clean the pasture was, and I had to think about it for a minute. And really, I don't use much pesticides or herbicides. It's very little spray and done, and it's really down to, I suppose, the fact that the grassland management has improved over the years, and the ryegrasses have improved. The percentage of ryegrass and a lot of the old swards have improved an awful lot. But I think a lot of it's to do with the fact that it's been grazed out clean, and that the grass is competing more with the weeds, and the weeds are more or less smothered out. So there's very little weeds in it. I wouldn't have much of an issue or problem with them.
So again, I suppose it's again, going back to the environmental benefits of it, you're probably saving on herbicides.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that you have a really dense sward.
It's
kind of about as keeping the weeds at bay.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
Yeah, very good. Phil, again, there's another one. There's a question here in relation. What about fertilizer applications? What about NPK hurting the mycorrhiza in terms of
Yeah, so look, there's always a balance with these things, but everything we're doing at the moment is trying to minimize the amount of fertilizer that we have to use. The reality is that we need to use a certain amount, but what our work is focused on is greatly reducing certainly the nitrogen content. And as we've outlined there with John, where we have to address soil P&K issues, none of these forages, whether it's grass or anything else, will grow if soil fertility is suboptimal. So we take advantage of what we have in terms of farmyard manure slurry on the farm, but where we're short, we will top up with artificial, compounds until we get to a point where the soil fertility is going to be adequate to actually grow these forages and grass, and then maintain them with very low levels. So it's about refining the system that, yes, in a lot of cases we have to correct a deficit, and we do that in the best way that we can. And then it's about getting the sward to do as much of the work as possible with the minimum amount of inputs, which it just so happens that that's a win for the environment, but it's also a win in terms of economics. You know, it's lower input costs for the farmer. So everybody, it's a common interest, and everybody is absolutely behind that.
Very good, very good. Gentlemen, I think time is pushing on, I suppose, and if I could maybe ask you all in one sentence to give us maybe one or two sentences to give us maybe a take-home message, I suppose, something that people could focus on their home farm in the short term, we'll say. I'll start with you, Phil.
Yeah, so I suppose we've covered it earlier. The time of year, it's a topical thing that we can do straight away is draw up a closing plan for your farm and stand back from it. What paddock needs to be closed first, second, third, and that I'm going to have grass for next spring.
Yeah, very good. Micheál?
For me, I'd say, Damien, it's all about measurement and I suppose utilising as much grass as you can and trying to get as much live weight gain off grass as possible. John is a great example and a great pioneer for grass. 4 or 5 years ago, he was only growing 7 ton. Today, he's growing double that. A plate meter is only roughly about the price of 2 ton of meal. It'll definitely pay for itself in the first year. But again, it has to be used correctly. So if anyone wants to join Pasture Base or wants to know any more about grassland, I suppose, measurement, they contact their Teagasc advisor or send us an email at support@pbi.ie and we can set them up on the system and get them rolling.
John, we'll give you the last word.
All right. Not too often I get the last word. I would say that for me over the years, and it's more or less similar to what Micheál has said there, but measuring grass for me, definitely it's a bug with me at this stage. I'm addicted to it. I can see what the difference it has made for me. And there's an old saying out there, what's measured is managed. And I think that's the take-home message for me, what's measured is managed.
Very good. Thanks, John, and thanks very much. I suppose in summing up briefly, I think it's fair to say that there is big payback for improving grassland management at farm level. And things like putting the proper fencing in place, introducing, getting your soil fertility right, grass measuring, all these things help to make more informed decisions in terms of your grassland. And again, it all makes for better flock performance, which will in turn deliver environmental benefits, but ultimately will improve the bottom line for your sheep enterprise. I want to thank our panelists, Philip Creighton, Micheál O'Leary and John O'Connell. Thanks to my colleague Declan McArdle. Declan was responsible for the recording and the editing of the video clips and for his help in streaming this event this evening. So thanks very much for that, Declan. I also like to thank my other Teagasc colleagues, too many to mention individually, who have helped in the planning, the organising and promoting and putting on of this virtual Sheep Week. Thanks again to our sponsors, FBD, and to yourselves, I suppose, the viewers, for tuning in this evening and for your questions and comments. If we didn't get, I think we got to most of the questions, but if we didn't, we'll endeavour to respond to you afterwards. The broadcast, along with today's social media releases, can be viewed from tomorrow on the Teagasc Virtual Sheep Week page. So they'll be there for you to view, and that'll be under the Grassland section. We hope you can join us for the rest of the week on live at Athenry at 7 p.m. And don't forget to check out our daily releases on the social media during the week as well. Tomorrow evening, our focus switches to breeding and genetics. The discussion will be led by Michael Godstein, and he'll be joined on the panel by Fiona McGovern and Anya O'Brien from Teagasc, along with Eamon Wall from Sheep Ireland. So until tomorrow evening at 7, good night and stay safe.